Section 8 of the Wonderful Adventures of Nils. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Wonderful Adventures of Nils by Selma Lagerlöf. Translated from the Swedish by Velma Swanston Howard. By Ronneby River. Friday, April 1st. Neither the wild geese nor Smirre Fox had believed that they would ever run across each other after they had left Skåne. But now it turned out so that the wild geese happened to take the route over Blekinge, and thither Smirre Fox had also gone. So far he had kept himself in the northern part of the province, and since he had not as yet seen any manor parks or hunting grounds filled with game and dainty young deer, he was more disgruntled than he could say. One afternoon, when Smirre tramped around in the desolate forest district of Mellanbygden, not far from Ronneby River, he saw a flock of wild geese fly through the air. Instantly he observed that one of the geese was white, and then he knew, of course, with whom he had to deal. Smirre began immediately to hunt the geese, just as much for the pleasure of getting a good square meal as for the desire to be avenged for all the humiliation that they had heaped upon him. He saw that they flew eastward until they came to Ronneby River. Then they changed their course and followed the river toward the south. He understood that they intended to seek a sleeping place along the river banks, and he thought that he should be able to get hold of a pair of them without much trouble. But when Smirre finally discovered the place where the wild geese had taken refuge, he observed they had chosen such a well protected spot that he couldn't get near. Ronneby River isn't any big or important body of water. Nevertheless, it is just as much talked of for the sake of its pretty shores. At several points it forces its way forward between steep mountain walls that stand upright out of the water, and are entirely overgrown with honeysuckle and bird cherry, mountain ash and osier; and there isn't much that can be more delightful than to row out on the little dark river on a pleasant summer day, and look upward on all the soft green that fastens itself to the rugged mountain sides. But now, when the wild geese and Smirre came to the river, it was cold and blustery spring winter. All the trees were nude, and there was probably no one who thought the least bit about whether the shore was ugly or pretty. The wild geese thanked their good fortune that they had found a sand strip large enough for them to stand upon, on a steep mountain wall. In front of them rushed the river, which was strong and violent in the snow melting time. Behind them they had an impassable mountain rock wall, and overhanging branches screened them. They couldn't have it better. The geese were asleep instantly, but the boy couldn't get a wink of sleep. As soon as the sun had disappeared, he was seized with a fear of the darkness, and a wilderness terror, and he longed for human beings. When he lay tucked in under the goose wing, he could see nothing, and only hear a little; and he thought if any harm came to the goosey gander, he couldn't save him. Noises and rustlings were heard from all directions, and he grew so uneasy that he had to creep from under the wing and seat himself on the ground beside the goose. Long sighted Smirre stood on the mountain's summit and looked down upon the wild geese. "You may as well give this pursuit up first as last," he said to himself. "You can't climb such a steep mountain. You can't swim in such a wild torrent. And there isn't the tiniest strip of land below the mountain which leads to the sleeping place. Those geese are too wise for you. Don't ever bother yourself again to hunt them." But Smirre, like all foxes, had found it hard to give up an undertaking already begun, and so he lay down on the extremest point of the mountain edge, and did not take his eyes off the wild geese. While he lay and watched them, he thought of all the harm they had done him. Yes, it was their fault that he had been driven from Skåne, and had been obliged to move to poverty stricken Blekinge. He worked himself up to such a pitch as he lay there, that he wished the wild geese were dead, even if he, himself, should not have the satisfaction of eating them. When Smirre's resentment had reached this height, he heard rasping in a large pine that grew close to him, and saw a squirrel come down from the tree, hotly pursued by a marten. Neither of them noticed Smirre, and he sat quietly and watched the chase, which went from tree to tree. He looked at the squirrel, who moved among the branches as lightly as though he had been able to fly. He looked at the marten, who was not as skilled at climbing as the squirrel, but who still ran up and along the branches just as securely as if they had been even paths in the forest. "If I could only climb half as well as either of them," thought the fox, "those things down there wouldn't sleep in peace very long." As soon as the squirrel had been captured, and the chase was ended, Smirre walked over to the marten, but stopped 2 steps away from him, to signify that he did not wish to cheat him of his prey. He greeted the marten in a very friendly manner, and wished him good luck with his catch. Smirre chose his words well, as foxes always do. The marten, on the contrary, who with his long and slender body, his fine head, his soft skin, and his light brown neck piece, looked like a little marvel of beauty, but in reality was nothing but a crude forest dweller, hardly answered him. "It surprises me," said Smirre, "that such a fine hunter as you are should be satisfied with chasing squirrels, when there is much better game within reach." Here he paused, but when the marten only grinned impudently at him, he continued: "Can it be possible that you haven't seen the wild geese that stand under the mountain wall? Or are you not a good enough climber to get down to them?" This time he had no need to wait for an answer. The marten rushed up to him with back bent and every separate hair on end. "Have you seen wild geese?" he hissed. "Where are they? Tell me instantly, or I'll bite your neck off." "No, you must remember that I'm twice your size, so be a little polite. I ask nothing better than to show you the wild geese." The next instant the marten was on his way down the steep, and while Smirre sat and watched how he swung his snake like body from branch to branch, he thought: "That pretty tree hunter has the wickedest heart in all the forest. I believe that the wild geese will have me to thank for a bloody awakening." But just as Smirre was waiting to hear the geese's death rattle, he saw the marten tumble from branch to branch, and plump into the river so the water splashed high. Soon thereafter wings beat loudly and strongly, and all the geese went up in a hurried flight. Smirre intended to hurry after the geese, but he was so curious to know how they had been saved, that he sat there until the marten came clambering up. That poor thing was soaked in mud, and stopped every now and then to rub his head with his forepaws. "Now wasn't that just what I thought that you were a booby, and would go and tumble into the river?" said Smirre contemptuously. "I haven't acted boobishly. You don't need to scold me," said the marten. "I sat already on one of the lowest branches and thought how I should manage to tear a whole lot of geese to pieces, when a little creature no bigger than a squirrel jumped up and threw a stone at my head with such force that I fell into the water, and before I had time to pick myself up." The marten didn't have to say any more. He had no audience. Smirre was already a long way off in pursuit of the wild geese. In the meantime Akka had flown southward in search of a new sleeping place. There was still a little daylight, and beside the half moon stood high in the heavens, so that she could see a little. Luckily she was well acquainted in these parts, because it had happened more than once that she had been wind driven to Blekinge